The alternate Second World War between the Allied powers of Western Europe and the Soviet Union saw the latter field an enlistment of forces exceeding 14 million. This number far outweighed the Allies' 3.4 million, plus about 1.7 million non-regular guerrilla and resistance forces. Even with support from the United States, the Allied powers of Western Europe were fighting an uphill battle against the might of the Soviet Union. Because of this, the Allies sought any and every advantage they could against their nemesis. One area the Allies excelled at was in the art of espionage. As soldiers clashed on the front lines, specially trained agents would work behind enemy lines, engage in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and theft. The most well-trained of these agents came from Great Britain, whose spies could infiltrate almost any building.
For king and country.
Armed with a pistol, the spy was a master of disguise. While typically seen wearing a tuxedo off-duty, when on mission, the spy dons the uniform of a Soviet infantryman. While disguised, the spy blends in perfectly among Soviet troops, they being none the wiser to the intruder in their midst. However, should these soldiers have an attack dog in their company, then the dog would immediately sniff out the spy, attacking and killing the imposter. If a spy managed to slip by any guard dogs, though, he would gain a variety of opportunities to disrupt operations at a Soviet base. After infiltrating a standard or advanced power plant, the spy would relay information back to his commander regarding the power status of a Soviet base. If the Soviet base had low power, then the Allied commander could be comfortable in attacking it, knowing the base wouldn't be able to utilize defenses such as the Tesla coil. When infiltrating an ore refinery or silo, the spy could learn what the storage capacity of the ore currently held inside these structures was at. Infiltrating a radar dome enabled the spy to gather intelligence regarding what the enemy sees, effectively giving the spy's commander the enemy's line of sight. This included discovering structures or units hidden within the fog of war. While a spy could infiltrate a service depot, it was mostly useless, as the unit didn't seem to do anything that would affect the structure. When it came to production buildings, such as construction yards, barracks, or war factories, the spy would gain information regarding what structure or unit was being produced by the enemy. The spy could relay this information back to his commander, which said commander could use in order to produce his own direct countermeasures. When a spy infiltrated a helipad, he would discover the amount of ammunition the currently landed helicopter had. In addition, the spy could see which new helicopter was currently being recruited at the pad, if any. A spy infiltrating an airfield yielded the same results as the helipad, but with one additional benefit. The spy's commander would receive a single use of parabombs. Making his way to the control tower, the spy could make contact with a Soviet bomber and relay new target coordinates for them to drop their payload. Unbeknownst to the Soviet bomber crew, these coordinates would usually result in them dropping parabombs on their own forces. Once such a strike was performed, the spy couldn't do another one. Lastly, a spy could infiltrate a submarine pen, which, like previous production buildings, would enable him to find out what naval unit was currently being built. However, the spy could also gain information regarding the locations of currently deployed submarines, which gave the spy's commander the ability to conduct a sonar pulse. When used, this pulse shows the exact position of submarines hidden beneath the waves for a few seconds. Like the parabombs, this sonar pulse can only be conducted once. While spies could show a commander how much ore was stored at a refinery or silo, they wouldn't steal credits associated with the gathered ore. That task was instead left to professional thieves.
Time for a little 5-finger discount.
Unlike spies, who were especially trained by the Allies, thieves were hired due to their expertise in stealing funds. Unarmed, thieves typically wore a black cloak, with either a hood or sombrero cordobés on their head. They also wore goggles over their eyes and white gloves on their hands. The thieves' attire wasn't exactly subtle, and unlike spies, they refused to disguise themselves as a Soviet infantryman. This meant that if a thief was spotted attempting to infiltrate a refinery, all units would be alerted and engage him, killing the thief before he could make it inside. But if the Soviet troops were distracted, the thief could slip inside a refinery or silo unnoticed, stealing half the credits in that structure. While spies and thieves played integral roles throughout the Second World War, there were a few notable missions where their expertise stood out. During the early stages of the war, the Allies' agent Tanya had gotten captured by the Soviets. At the time, she contained vital information regarding the Soviet Union's secret Iron Curtain project. Field Commander A9 was tasked with leading forces to rescue Tanya, who was being held at a prison in Grodno. The best method for rescuing Tanya was to get a spy into the prison. The spy was on a time limit, as the Allies suspected the Soviets would either execute Tanya or transfer her to Moscow, where rescue would be practically impossible. The spy first had to attain transport at a nearby forward base, which was patrolled by attack dogs. After successfully slipping past the Soviet guards and their dogs, the spy entered a war factory where he was able to hijack a supply truck. He drove the supply truck south through the Soviets' main base. Upon discovering the prison, the spy jumped out of the truck, sending it careening into a cache of explosive barrels. The spy made his way into the prison, finding and rescuing Tanya at the cost of his own life. Tanya fought her way through the prison, bringing the building crumbling to the ground as she made her escape. She then destroyed 4 SAM sites, allowing a transport helicopter to fly in and exfiltrate her from the area. With Tanya successfully rescued, Allied reinforcements arrived, capturing the Soviets' forward base and using it to wipe out the rest of the primary base in the south. With Tanya back, the Allies now had an idea on where the Soviets were conducting research on their new Iron Curtain weapon. A research facility was located somewhere in southeastern Greece, and Field Commander A9 was tasked with obtaining whatever data he could gather there. Once the data had been retrieved, the commander was to destroy the entire facility. After establishing a base in the area, the Allied commander recruited a spy to infiltrate a nearby Soviet-controlled radar dome. The spy succeeded, pinpointing the exact location of the tech centers that needed to be infiltrated. The Allied commander ferried a strike force across the water where the facility was located. While the commander's military forces clashed with the Soviets, spies were able to infiltrate at least one of the tech centers. With the data from the tech centers now in Allied hands, the Soviet facility was wiped out. Later in the war, as the tide was starting to turn in the Allies' favor, one of their spies found out that Stalin was working on a new powerful weapon called an atomic bomb. Such a weapon, if deployed, would bring about the Allies' defeat. Luckily for them, one of Stalin's key atomic strategists, Vladimir Kosygin, wished to defect after learning Stalin planned to use his own troops as sacrificial lambs to draw Allied forces into a trap. Once the Allies took the bait, one of these atomic bombs would be dropped, wiping out both Allied and Soviet forces. Field Commander A9 was assigned the mission to extract Kosygin from the Riga compound. While the commander's forces assaulted the Soviet compound, a spy infiltrated the command center and made contact with Kosygin. The defector exited the center and jumped aboard an APC, which brought him back to the Allied commander's base. There, a transport helicopter flew in and extracted Kosygin from the area. The final battle to end the war took place in Moscow, where Stalin made his final stand against the Allies. During the initial assault, Tanya, accompanied by a couple of thieves, made their way through the Soviets' forward base, attempting to find a refinery or silos to steal credits from. They eventually did, with the thieves infiltrating the silos and taking the credits. With this extra money on hand, the Allied commander was able to establish a base and ultimately go on to destroy all Soviet forces in the area. The Soviets themselves also made use of spies during the Second World War, but not to the extent of the Allies. The most notable use of Soviet spies occurred during the Soviet campaign of the Aftermath expansion. A couple of prominent arms dealers known as the Molotov brothers worked with the Soviet Union to supply arms to comrades fighting in foreign lands. However, the brothers were suspected of also having dealings with the Allies. To confirm these suspicions, a Soviet spy was sent to the brothers' base, located on an island somewhere off the coast of Spain. The spy made his way across the island, careful to avoid any guard dogs. The spy successfully infiltrated the brothers' command center. While eavesdropping on them, the spy discovered that the brothers, whose names were Daniel and Yuri, had in fact been colluding with the Allies, particularly the Greek general Stavros. The spy was discovered, and made his escape back to his initial insertion point on the beach, calling for reinforcements using a signal flare. Reinforcements arrived, but not before the spy was killed by an attack dog. The Soviet reinforcements established a base on the west side of the island. The base was attacked by the brothers, who were utilizing Soviet equipment, with the Allies sending reinforcements to support the arms dealers. The brothers even utilized their own thieves to try and steal credits from the Soviet base. Despite the support of the Allies, the Soviet forces were able to destroy the enemy base and kill both of the Molotov brothers. With the death of Stalin, the Second World War had come to an end, and the Allies hoped to never see another such war again. However, this was not to be, as the new premier of the Soviet Union, Alexander Romanov, sought revenge against the Allies for the destruction they wrought against the Russian motherland. Initially, the Soviet Union focused their efforts against the United States, though the Western European nations would eventually get brought into the war, and Great Britain once again contributed with their specially trained spies.
Agent ready.
While essentially performing the same covert tasks as their predecessors, the spies of the Third World War had some improved capabilities up their sleeves. For one, they could disguise themselves as almost any infantrymen, from the Soviets' conscripts, flak, and Tesla troopers, to Yuri's initiates, brutes, and Yuri clones. A spy could even disguise himself as an attack dog, though a real attack dog would sniff him out, eliminating the canine imposter. Unlike the spies of the Second World War, when the Third World War spies infiltrated a building, they primarily focused on sabotaging said structure, rather than intelligence gathering. When infiltrating any type of power plant, the spy would completely shut down all power at the enemy base for several seconds, bringing most defenses offline and slowing production. When infiltrating a radar facility, the spy erases all known battlefield data gathered by that base's commander, effectively reshrouding the enemy commander in the fog of war. Since hiring professional thieves during the Second World War didn't yield the consistent benefits the Allies hoped for, they instead opted to train their spies in the art of stealing credits. Thus, whenever a spy infiltrated an ore refinery, he would steal about 20% of the enemy's credits. The spy could perform this action against Yuri's mobile slave miners too. Whenever a spy infiltrated unit production buildings like the barracks or war factory, the spy would attain vital information regarding the units and send it back to their commander. The commander would then hand this information out to his own soldiers and vehicle crews, allowing them to gain better insight into their enemy's tactics and equipment. This meant that future infantrymen and vehicle crews would receive extra training, deploying to the battlefield as veterans. Spies would be on the lookout to infiltrate any superweapons that had been deployed by the enemy. If a spy managed to infiltrate an Iron Curtain, nuclear missile, or other superweapon, he would sabotage their control systems by resetting their timers, which delayed their deployment. Battle labs were a prime target for a spy to infiltrate, as they could gather data on whatever new technology was being researched by the enemy. Depending on which faction's battle lab the spy infiltrated, depended on what data could be gathered and used by the spy's commander. If a spy infiltrated a Soviet battle lab, the Allied commander would gain the capability to train Chrono Ivans. These were essentially just a standard Crazy Ivan demolition expert, except equipped with a Chrono backpack, allowing the unit to teleport across the battlefield, placing bombs on enemy units or structures. If a spy infiltrated one of Yuri's battle labs, he could attain research enabling his commander to train Psi Commandos. Psi Commandos were Yuri clones who had been reconditioned to work for the Allies. In addition to their standard mind control capabilities, the Psi Commando was armed with C4 charges to blow up enemy buildings. During the Third World War, it was common for Allied commanders to fight against other Allied forces who had been mind-controlled by the Soviets or Yuri's forces. Because of this, an Allied spy might find himself infiltrating an Allied battle lab, the results of which would be attaining data regarding the development of chrono backpacks. These backpacks, normally worn by chrono legionnaires, would be given to SEAL units who would receive the new designation of chrono commandos. On the off chance that a Soviet commander had Allied spies in his arsenal, and used them to infiltrate another opposing Soviet commander's battle lab, he could gain the ability to create a Yuri Prime. A Yuri Prime was more powerful than a standard Yuri clone, able to mind control units from a greater distance thanks to his enhanced psionic powers. It should be noted that this Yuri Prime is not the same as the Yuri Prime commando unit used by Yuri himself during the events encompassing the Psychic Dominator disaster. Even if they were disguised as one of Yuri's infantry units, spies had a difficult time infiltrating one of the enigmatic Psychic's bases. Structures like the Psychic Radar didn't just detect units, but also their thoughts. So long as one of these radars was active, a spy approaching one of Yuri's bases would be quickly killed or mind-controlled. The most notable use of spies during the Third World War occurred during Operation Dark Knight. The American President Dugin sought help from Western Europe to aid the United States in its war against the Soviet Union. The leaders of the European nations agreed, but only if the US helped them to destroy nuclear missile silos along the border between Germany and Soviet-controlled Poland. Agent Tanya, accompanied by a few spies, were led by an unnamed Allied commander to complete the mission. The infiltration team first needed to figure out the exact locations of the missile silos, and the place that held that information was a nearby Soviet battle lab. This battle lab was heavily guarded, but Tanya created an alternative opening through the defenses thanks to some misplaced explosive barrels. Through this new entrance, one of the spies was able to slip past the guards and attack dogs, making his way inside the battle lab. With the exact locations of the missile silos now known, the team moved to take them out. The first silo had formidable defenses surrounding it, in the form of Tesla coils and infantry patrols. However, Tesla coils were power-intensive structures, and the surviving spies were ordered to infiltrate any nearby reactors, shutting off power to the defenses. With the towers offline, Tanya was able to move in, eliminating the guards and Tesla coils before moving on to destroy the missile silo. The team then moved on to the second silo, which was also heavily defended. Tanya looked for alternative routes into the base, and found some Allied prisoners nearby, which she rescued. These rescued units, combined with the original team, helped punch a hole through the base's defenses, enabling Tanya to demolish the final missile silo. With this mission complete, the European nations pledged their full support toward the United States in their fight against the Soviet Union. Germany in particular gave the Americans access to Albert Einstein, whose inventions were integral in securing victory against the Soviet Union in the Third World War, as well as the Psychic Dominator disaster that occurred later on. After the events of the Psychic Dominator disaster, war would again break out between the Allies and Soviet Union. To avoid being defeated again, General Anatoly Cherdenko used a newly created time machine hidden beneath the Kremlin to travel back to the past and eliminate Albert Einstein. With Einstein gone, a new timeline was created, one where the Soviet Union was winning their war against the Allies. However, this meddling in the space-time continuum resulted in the creation of a third major power, the Empire of the Rising Sun, which would go on to launch attacks against the Soviet Union and Allied nations. There's a saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So while the Soviets may have altered the space-time continuum, the Allies still made use of spies to perform all manner of espionage and sabotage against their old and new adversaries.
How's the disguise holding up?
As in the previous conflicts, the best of the Allies' spies came from Great Britain. Their training included disguising themselves as almost any infantry unit. This included a bear costume, as the Soviets in this timeline used bears instead of attack dogs as their animal companions. Actual bears could sniff out the disguised spies and quickly eliminate them. For the Empire, they used small flying drones called burst drones to detect disguised spies. Due to bases having the capabilities of being constructed atop platforms out at sea, spies now received aquatic training. This training enabled a spy to swim across a body of water in their wetsuit, or even while wearing one of their many disguises. Whenever the spy successfully infiltrated a production structure such as a barracks, war factory, or naval yard, he would shut down the building, making it unable to assemble or train any units for a few seconds. In addition, the spy would transmit any data he gathered from that infiltrated building back to his commander. This data enabled the commander to see any units that had already been produced by that building. Airfields that had been infiltrated would not allow any aircraft to land at them. If a spy managed to infiltrate a power generation building, he would temporarily reduce the total power supply being generated at the enemy base to 0. With low power, base production would be slowed, while all defenses and superweapons are temporarily disabled. When infiltrating a refinery, the spy steals about 2,000 credits, regardless if the enemy commander actually has that amount or not. If the spy made it inside a construction yard or other expansion structure such as an outpost, he would temporarily disable the enemy commander's radar. The spy would also transmit exact coordinates of the construction yard to his own commander, enabling the commander to permanently gain vision on the enemy construction yard. Infiltrating a technology structure such as a Soviet battle lab or the Empire's nanotech mainframe allowed the spy to disable all Tier 3 units. This included units such as the Soviets' Kirov airship or the Empire's King Oni battle walker. Lastly, for superweapons, the spy would disrupt their launch routines, causing the timers on said superweapons to be reset. Allied spies no longer just went around infiltrating enemy structures. They were given a substantial amount of credits to bribe enemy units into joining the Allied cause. All the spy had to do was disguise himself as a Soviet or Imperial soldier and approach the ground units associated with neither of those factions. Once close enough, he would bribe them with 1,000 credits, which was usually enough to convince the units to immediately turn against their former countrymen and engage them in combat. In order to properly bribe nearby enemies, however, the spy had to remove his disguise, which exposed him to enemy units that did not fall under this financial spell. Units that could not be bribed included commandos, aircraft, and certain naval vessels. The spy had to wait a while before conducting another bribe, since his commanding officer first had to approve and wire the reimbursement of credits to the spy's bank account. During the early stages of the war, Allied forces were spread across Europe trying to retake what was conquered by the Soviets. After stopping the Soviet Union from invading Great Britain, a new Allied commander was sent to the city of Caen in southern France. There, the commander was tasked with leading Allied forces in destroying the naval port the Soviets had established. While the unnamed Allied commander focused on the port, his co-commander, Warren Fuller, focused on rescuing Allied leaders trapped inside the city's conference center. During the mission, Agent Tanya and a retinue of spies were tasked with infiltrating the Soviets' port authority buildings. There were a total of 4 of these port buildings, 2 on each of the 2 main islands off the coast of Caen. These islands were heavily guarded, with the Soviets having plenty of bears to uncover disguised spies. Tanya could eliminate the bears, but only if she could first get past the Tesla coils protecting the beaches. Working in tandem, the spies would infiltrate reactors on the island, shutting off power to the defenses. This would give Tanya enough time to eliminate Soviet troops guarding the beach and destroy the Tesla coils. With these forces eliminated, Tanya could then kill any bears patrolling the island. With the bears gone, the spies would have no problem infiltrating the port buildings, where they would plant explosives on any docked vessels nearby. Once all the port buildings had been infiltrated, Tanya made her way inside the main port authority, issuing a recall for most of the Soviet fleet to return to harbor. Once done, the spies detonated their charges, destroying any Soviet vessels in harbor. Once this primary objective was accomplished, the unnamed Allied commander and Warren Fuller combined their forces to drive out the rest of the Soviet forces located in the city itself. The Empire of the Rising Sun's entry into the war caught both the Soviet Union and Allies by surprise. Individually, neither one could take on the Empire by themselves, but combined, they stood a chance. The Empire had placed a gigantic floating fortress in the North Sea, which needed to be destroyed. After recovering data regarding the Empire's fleet from a nearby sunken vessel, the Allies and Soviets launched a joint operation against the Empire's forces stationed on a couple of islands near the floating fortress. A radar ship, acting as a spotter for long-range artillery on the fortress, was located at each of these islands, preventing the Allied and Soviet navies from getting close to the fortress. Two small strike forces were sent in to deal with these radar ships. The first strike force consisted of Russia's greatest sniper, Natasha, who was supported by 4 Allied spies. The spies were tasked with infiltrating power generators on the island to shut down its defenses. While the power was down, Natasha would call in an airstrike to destroy the generators and nearby defense turrets. There were 3 generators in total that had to be destroyed. Once all were dealt with, Natasha called in an airstrike directly on the radar ship, sending the vessel to a watery grave. Tanya and a few Soviet engineers dealt with the second radar ship, which allowed Soviet and Allied naval forces to establish aquatic bases close to the floating fortress, without needing to worry about being bombarded by its long-range artillery. After an intense naval battle, the floating fortress was destroyed, freeing the North Sea of this imperial menace. While their joint operations against the Empire seemed to be going well, the American President Ackerman didn't trust the Soviets and decided to take matters into his own hands by activating a secret weapon at Mount Rushmore. To stop Ackerman and preserve their alliance with the Soviets, the Allies sent Tanya and a few spies to Mount Rushmore to destroy the communication tower there, in hopes of preventing Ackerman from remotely firing the superweapon. The spies, commanded by Warren Fuller, infiltrated a nearby power plant. This action allowed Tanya to slip past the defense turrets and destroy the plant, keeping the turrets offline for good. This enabled Tanya to reach the comm tower and destroy it, preventing Ackerman from remotely firing the superweapon. This action, however, did not prevent the president from trying to activate the weapon in person at the Rushmore firebase. The Allied forces successfully destroyed this firebase, with Ackerman being killed when his helicopter was shut down attempting to exfiltrate the area. Though Ackerman had been killed, the alliance between the Allies and Soviet Union was, for now, maintained. After the Allies achieved victory against the Empire of the Rising Sun and Soviet Union, they found themselves distracted trying to put down uprisings within the nations of their defeated enemies. The corporation known as FutureTech took advantage of this situation, hiring a commander to go across the world and collect units and weapon systems from each of the 3 major powers. The FutureTech commander was sent to a location in Great Britain, where many of the Allies' spies in training practiced the arts of disguise, infiltration, bribing, swimming, smooth talking, bow tie tying, and more. Allied Commander Giles Price was supervising the training of these spies at the time, and he did not appreciate the FutureTech commander interfering. Giles sent the spies against the FutureTech commander, and while some managed to slip through and interfere with base operations, the commander deployed plenty of countermeasures to uncover and eliminate the spies. The FutureTech commander quickly put together a strike force that destroyed Giles' base. Embarrassed by this turn of events, Giles left the scene, leaving behind the surviving spies in training. These spies would end up offering their services to the FutureTech commander, and most importantly, provide the corporation considerable insight into the Allies' spy network. While perhaps unappreciated, spies played critical roles in helping the Allies achieve victory against the Soviet Union during the Second World War and both iterations of the Third World War. Though uprisings in Japan and the Soviet Union have pushed out their occupation forces, the Allies are likely still keeping tabs on both adversaries using their vast network of spies. A network that may be compromised by FutureTech, who might use such information for their own nefarious purposes.